Thanks, Kenton, and thanks everyone for coming. If any of you, some of you I think have taken some of my classes, know that I tend to move around a lot, so I'm going to try not to so the camera operator doesn't get too dizzy back there. I want to talk a little bit about this project. When I gave the talk in San Francisco, it was very fast and to the point, as sometimes academic presentations at conferences can be. So I wanted to slow down a little bit and actually get to talk about it. But I should start with the most obvious question, which is who in here knows who Gabourey Sidibe is or knows anything about her? Okay, pretty good. What do you know about her? What have you seen that she's in? Okay, Precious. This is the movie that kind of launched her to stardom, plucked from obscurity to be the star in the long-titled movie Precious, based on the novel Push by Sapphire. They couldn't call the movie Push for copyright reasons. There was already a movie coming out that year called Push, and so they changed it to that very long-winded title. Okay, what else do we know about Gabourey Sidibe, or what have we seen her in? Anybody? Okay, American Horror Story seasons 3 and 4, mostly season 3, a little bit in season 4. Okay, absolutely. Anybody watching Empire on Fox right now? No, the hip-hop family melodrama. One person, that's good. So she's on Fox's hit show Empire, though she has a pretty small role as the secretary Becky. She is kind of emerged as a minor star since her role in Precious, and a star that I'm particularly interested in because I've been researching stars who deviate from our conceptions of what film and television stardom looks like, particularly stars whose bodies really deviate from our sense of kind of cultural norms around beauty and health. As the title suggests, I want to be situating Gabourey Sidibe in a discussion of kind of post-racial culture in the U.S. When she kind of emerges on the scene in 2009, the media was kind of in the grips of a major discourse about post-racial identity and what post-racialism even means, largely because thanks to the election of Barack Obama in 2008, there was a whole host of debates and discussions about whether the U.S. had actually entered what's called a post-racial era. The idea that we have kind of moved beyond the debates and discussions of this civil rights era into a seemingly new era of opportunity that could be described as post-racial. And we'll talk about a little bit more about what post-racial actually means in a minute. But Sidibe emerges as a star and kind of captures our public attention because she, rides the wave of this debate about post-racial discourse. She was not the first, she was nominated for an Oscar, and she wasn't the first African-American woman to be nominated for an Oscar. The first one who won the Oscar was who? Nope. First African-American woman to win the Best Actress Oscar. Anybody know? Wasn't that long ago. It was Halle Berry for Monsters Ball. So compared to Halle Berry, who is a biracial, fairly light-skinned former beauty contestant, Gabourey Sidibe really stood out as a kind of new entry into celebrity culture in that she's a Senegalese American, or her father was Senegalese, and so she's fairly dark-skinned and 300 pounds in a media culture that definitely still has certain types of preferences for the types of people of color and women of color that they represent on screen. So there was a lot of favorable discussion about Gabourey Sidibe and the idea that this was a turning point for Hollywood. The movie Precious garnered a lot of Academy Award nominations and won a lot of Academy Awards. So it became part of this narrative that Hollywood was changing, that Hollywood was starting to adapt to the new post-racial U.S. And someone like Gabourey Sidibe kind of became an emblem for that particular change. Obviously, that discussion was fairly short-lived, and that the next few Oscar seasons that come around were pretty white in nature. The Oscars are pretty critiqued for not necessarily acknowledging the achievements of actors and filmmakers of color. So that's the bigger context that I want to talk about Gabourey Sidibe and think about why and how a star like Sidibe functions in our culture and society. And I'll talk a little bit about stardom in a minute. But we should talk a little bit about what I mean by post-racial, because this is kind of one of the key categories that we want to situate her in. Anybody heard the term, other than me just a few minutes ago, post-racial? No, a few people. What do we think that really means, that we live in a post-racial world, when people say that? I don't know if people usually ask the audience questions in these forums, but I'm going to. What do you think?
Obama is sometimes described as our first post-racial president.
Okay, right. Obama is a post-racial president. What do we think that means? What makes him a post-racial president?
But his race didn't have anything to do with him being elected.
Okay, absolutely. The idea...
He's transcended racial boundaries.
Okay, absolutely. That we can transcend race. That Obama gets held up as this figure because he, while he's the first black president, his election signifies that we have moved beyond kind of the racial kind of discord that marked the civil rights era and marked the culture wars of the 80s and 90s, that he's a figure who can transcend race. In terms of media culture, when we talked about post-racial discourse, there's a few different ideas. It tends to be a pretty big umbrella category. There's a great book that tracks the usage of the term post-racial and notes that it really picks up in the mid-2000s, in the few years before Obama is elected president, and then there's a wave of discussion of post-racialism and the idea of a post-racial U.S. With Obama. But it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Sometimes the more extreme definition, of course, is that we live in a world in which race doesn't matter anymore, in which not only have we moved beyond the debates of the civil rights era, but that the idea of racial identity is just passé. Everybody is kind of mixing and blending their identities, and that we have no use for the idea of race anymore. That's a pretty extreme definition. The more common definition is simply that we have moved into a world in which the definitions of race don't have as much weight as they used to. So I talk about the idea of fluid racial identities, that there are more and more celebrities and figures in media who are biracial, of mixed race, and that we increasingly, particularly in kind of conservative discourses around affirmative action, construct race as something that's beneficial, right? That having a certain kind of racial or ethnic identity can help you in the marketplace. We see more diversity in casting and representation in media, and the idea that if we can have sitcoms that revolve around people of color, then clearly we have kind of moved beyond certain kind of debates and discussions. And a key term for this is the idea of colorblindness. That the ideal way for people to operate in the world is to be colorblind, to not acknowledge or discuss race openly, to kind of have this idea that, I am open to everything. Race doesn't matter to me. I'm completely colorblind in all the decisions that I make. Look at me. I've got a black friend. Thus, I am post-racial. So what do you think the problems are with colorblindness as a way of being in the world, particularly when we think about kind of race and the kind of continuing racial tensions that we have in the U.S.? Why is it a problem to endorse this view that you just don't see race? Anybody want to try? Okay. One, because we do. As numerous studies and research and a lot of examples show around the world, race still matters. While we have kind of promoted this idea of colorblindness, and I think a lot of this comes back to, particularly for a lot of people in the room, for the ways that you were taught the civil rights movement in elementary school, and Martin Luther King Jr. revolved around this idea of that what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for was a potentially colorblind world, one where race doesn't matter. But we clearly haven't gotten there yet. And so to embrace this idea of colorblindness is to ignore discussions of race, to ignore the continuing legacy of racial discrimination, and to in many ways to adopt a position of privilege. It's be highly problematic for me, a middle-class privileged white dude, to be going around talking about how I don't see race and race doesn't matter, because maybe it doesn't matter for me as much because I exist in a position of privilege. But for people of color who exist in the United States, race still matters. And so this idea of colorblindness is really kind of central to the idea of post-racial identity. And as it says up here, what the post-racial discourse ultimately does is promote a viewpoint where we are thinking about individuals and choice. That when we talk about racial structures, we're talking about people trying to be more post-racial, trying to be more colorblind, trying to demonstrate their diversity on an individual level. And instead, we don't have discussions about structures. We don't have a discussion about about policy and law and about kind of long-standing cultural traditions that really impact the continuing legacy of race in America. Instead, we go around talking about how individuals should be less racist, how individuals should promote a post-racial viewpoint. We go around celebrating folks like Gabourey Sidibe, saying, oh, look at how far we have come, that we have made room for a figure like this in pop culture. But it doesn't necessarily get us thinking about the extreme lack of, say, women of color who are filmmakers in Hollywood. We don't think about the structures that limit roles and casting in Hollywood. Instead, we talk about figures who, kind of assuage our sense of guilt and kind of affirm this idea of change, a progressive narrative of change. So that's why I'm really interested in Sidibe. She's a really, there she is. Yeah, Barry.
Would there also be an argument that when you have the distinctions of race, there's elements of pride with race involved as well? The idea that there are certain races and characteristics within the races themselves that they hold true and dear to themselves.
You mean in terms of kind of...
You wouldn't want to have a level playing field, that race actually, it's good because there are certain aspects of the race that kind of perpetuates who and what they are.
Yeah, and this really, that cuts to the core of, the culture wars in the 80s and 90s and ideas about multiculturalism and what kind of racial identities and kind of racial beliefs that we kind of adhere to in America. For many decades, the main discourse was that idea about celebrating difference, that difference is inherent but good, and that because we should be celebrating different heritage, different traditions, different kinds of backgrounds amongst people, and celebrating that difference, that was kind of the key. That was the major discourse of the 80s and 90s around race. And I think post-racial identity, the idea of post-racial discourse modifies that a little bit. It takes the key parts of that and says, yes, we should look at people of color and say, you have all these wonderful things, and that's going to make you stand out and succeed in society. But it means that we also don't talk about the differences that are usually not sources of pride within communities. We don't talk about discrimination. We don't talk about the kinds of problems that get kind of glommed onto different racial and ethnic groups because of their kind of structural position in the society. That answer that at all, Barry? Okay, good, yeah. I think Sidibe is a really interesting figure in this discussion because she so clearly provides an alternative narrative about stardom. We shouldn't deny the fact that she has become somewhat of a minor celebrity represents somewhat of a progressive step for our culture. That she's providing images that we typically haven't seen in Hollywood, in popular culture, or if they're images that we have seen a little bit of, they're very different. And I'll talk about some of the stereotypes that usually kind of follow African American women in film and television. So she's providing a very kind of powerful image of success, of the idea that a cultural change, progressive cultural change is happening. But instead of just accepting that at face value, we need to put pressure on the kinds of narratives that surround Sidibe and the kinds of narratives around race that a figure like Sidibe promotes. And again, I should say this, we're not actually talking about Gabourey Sidibe here. I've never met Gabourey Sidibe. I'm sure she's a lovely person. But what we're really talking about are media discourses. We're talking about how the idea of Gabourey Sidibe is presented to all of us through her roles and largely through the kind of the journalism and the discourse that surrounds her. When people interview her, what questions do they ask? How do they tell her backstory? How do they describe her in media? This isn't really anything to do with her as a person as it is with her as a public persona and how and why we've constructed that persona. So some of the key questions I'm interested in asking then, right? What ideas about race and individual achievement in contemporary America are manifest in her persona? And what do these ideas suggest about racial inequality and the solutions to inequality in a culture increasingly reluctant to discuss structural injustice? She raises these questions about how did she succeed? How has the culture accommodated a star like Sidibe? And how does it frame her fame in a particular way to say that this is a model for success? This is a model of post-racial success in the entertainment field. As my title suggests, I'm going to be particularly focusing on the idea of self-confidence as a discourse. That one of the major narratives that gets promoted around Sidibe is this idea that she has succeeded because of her kind of innate charm and self-confidence in the world. And this is a discourse that extends well beyond Sidibe, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. So, as Kenton was saying, this is part of a larger project for me where I'm writing a book about a series of case studies of stars who have kind of risen to fame, but have done so in spite of bodies that have typically led them towards more stereotypical roles. My case studies in that book, I'm looking at Melissa McCarthy, star of Bridesmaids, Spy, the forthcoming Ghostbusters reboot, which I'm very excited for. Peter Dinklage, the dwarf actor from Game of Thrones. Gabourey Sidibe, who we're talking about today. Danny Trejo, for any of you who've seen the Machete films, the Latino action star Danny Trejo. Betty White, and particularly her late career resurgence, and Laverne Cox, the transgender actress who's on Orange is the New Black. So those are the case studies that I'm singling out, but this is clearly part of a larger wave in which we're seeing more and more celebrities who deviate from our expectations about beauty and health, and particularly celebrities who kind of challenge our ideas about what a film and television star should look like. So figures like Mindy Kaling, Lena Dunham, Queen Latifah, who's been around for a while, Rebel Wilson, R.J. Mitz from Breaking Bad. These figures who have kind of risen to fame, even if minor stardom, and often become these kind of icons of inclusivity in Hollywood. Stars that we can say, oh, look at these stars, look at these celebrities, we've made room for them. This shows that we are becoming more progressive, we're becoming more accepting as a culture. So my overall project is kind of putting pressure on that narrative, looking at how and why such stars are allowed to become famous. What kind of accommodations do we make to say, yes, this is, there's a space for stars like this, but what are the limitations of those accommodations as well? What are the narratives that we impose on those stars in order to say, this is what success looks like. This is how someone achieves success in Hollywood and in America today. So. This is particularly interesting for Sidibe in thinking about the idea of stardom because she so visibly challenges a lot of the discourses around femininity and race in U.S. culture. There have been a series of larger African-American women who have attained some kinds of minor stardom in U.S. popular culture, but largely actresses who look like Sidibe have been pushed into two stereotypical roles. Either the welfare queen, the kind of a symbol of kind of gluttony and excess that is kind of draining the U.S. system, or as the mammy figure, a kind of a lovable African-American nurse who takes care of, sacrifices all of herself to take care of her young, typically white charges. Those are really the two dominant visions that we've had for larger African-American women in U.S. media throughout most of its history. So the fact that Sidibe has kind of emerged as a star who deviates from those stereotypical roles is a really interesting phenomenon, and so we kind of want to put pressure on it. And it's particularly fascinating today because we're in the midst of this so-called obesity epidemic. Increasingly in U.S. culture, it's become standard for us to stigmatize and put pressure on overweight bodies as markers of of disease and health and social decay. That's something that's wrong with America today, is that we have too much obesity. And so figures like Sidibe, who are celebrated for their self-confidence and their inner beauty, kind of go against the grain of that discourse around the obesity epidemic. And that those discourses are particularly relevant for women of color who are far more stigmatized than white women when it comes to obesity in media. All right, so how has Sidibe's stardom navigated the cultural stereotypes linking Black obesity and low social class to the stigma of like the welfare mother? So the methods, I'm using critical discourse analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm looking at the discourses, I'm looking at the media that surrounds Sidibe, particularly in popular magazines, and analyzing them and trying to situate them within larger structures of kind of power. So not just thinking about why, why journalists ask certain questions of her, or why they tell her story in a certain way, but trying to put those questions into a bigger structure of power. How are power relations influenced in the kinds of the discourses and narratives we create around her? I'll scoop this. So my data here, I limited it down to 46 articles ranging from 2007 to 2014. I can probably update my data set now that it's gone by a little bit. But these are mostly popular magazine articles, so looking at stuff that appears in Cosmopolitan and Good Housekeeping and Jet and Ebony, and looking particularly at in-depth articles about Sidibe, kind of profiles of Sidibe, and looking at those discourses. What are the key narratives that those reporters use to talk about her? What are the language they use to talk about her? What descriptors do they use to describe her body and her performances? As it says here, part of this is about understanding stardom itself as a discourse. As I said before, I don't really know Gabourey Sidibe. I'm assuming nobody here knows Gabourey Sidibe, and yet many of us know a lot of stuff about her because she's a mediated phenomenon. She is a star who has a kind of a media persona that's actively constructed, not just by herself, but by her agents, by journalists, by the publicity machines of the Hollywood studios, and by her performances. And all of those kind of cohere together to form what we call in Star Studies as her star text, right? The kind of the range of meanings that come through all of these different discourses, and we kind of associate with her as a persona. So one of the things I want to do is look at that text and see what are the major trends and how she is constructed. So, not surprisingly, there are clear negative responses to Sidibe that we see, particularly around the release of Precious. These are some clips or some quotes from prominent film critics who most people would say are being a tad bit mean in their, and kind of overtly stigmatizing in their discussion and description of Sidibe. So Armand White, who goes out of his way to say controversial things all the time, said that Sidibe was so obese her face seems bloated into a permanent pout. Anthony Lane in The New Yorker said that she's grimly overweight, her face so filled out that the play of normal expression seems restricted. And David Edelstein says that Sidibe's head is like a balloon on the body of a zeppelin, her cheeks so inflated that they squish her eyes into slits. So you see a little bit of this in the discourse surrounding Sidibe. People who overtly go out of their way to stigmatize her size, to suggest that she is some sort of grotesque spectacle on screen, and that really ties into those discourses about the obesity epidemic and the idea that her body is a reflection of something kind of wrong with her or wrong with the culture at large. But what's most interesting, of course, is that this represents a pretty small percentage of the coverage around Sidibe. What we see more often are these overtly celebratory images of Sidibe and discussions of Sidibe's rise to fame. Coverage that really goes to kind of mark itself as progressive and inclusive and say, look at this is a breath of fresh air, someone who's actually challenging our obsession with thinness, challenging our obsession with skin tone and with African-American actresses in the US, and they kind of construct her as a kind of a body image heroine, a figure that we can celebrate as a progressive direction in the culture. So you can see her on the cover of Elle here, right, looking very nice, on the cover of Ebony. And a lot of these stories focus on her as a success story, someone who we should not be stigmatizing for her weight, but celebrating because she has made it. So, as I said earlier, one of the biggest trends that you see in the discussion of her and why she succeeded is an emphasis on self-confidence. That why she is able to kind of achieve stardom and kind of transcend some of these stereotypes is because she has, as it says here, a unique brand of confidence. She's bubbly, confident, outspoken, more confident in herself than anybody she's ever met. Oprah even said it's like she's from another planet because she's so evolved, so confident, so secure about who she is. And if Oprah says it, it has to be true. Has to be. If Sidibe could bottle up her buoyant self-assurance and sell it, she'd be richer than Bill Gates. And 17 magazine relied on Sidibe to help readers get killer confidence. So they had like a little insert where, how do you get confident? Let's ask Gabourey Sidibe, because she's super duper confident. So this is a really interesting trajectory, and particularly at this moment in history, because we have become somewhat concerned with self-confidence as a narrative, particularly for women. And it's clear that when they're talking about self-confidence, what they're talking about is a certain vision of feminine self-confidence. They're not talking about the self-confidence of an assertive artistic performer who's going to go out and tackle new and challenging roles. What they're talking about is feminine self-confidence. And so when they talk about that self-confidence, they most frequently refer to her as bubbly, giggly, girly, sassy. They talk about her love of fashion and makeup. So what makes her self-confident isn't just like a general sense of self-confidence, but that she has a confident femininity about her. And there's kind of an interesting way that they're very much forcing that self-confidence into this narrative about femininity. That what makes her self-confidence so unique is that she can kind of embody this femininity. In fact, it's interesting when you read the interviews with Lee Daniels, who directed her in Precious. Almost all the time, he keeps making these insistent references to the fact that she has 4 or 5 boyfriends, always knocking down her door. Even when the interviewees aren't asking him about that at all, he's kind of constantly insisting that we see her as this hyper-feminine creature. And that's what's so amazing about her, is that even though she deviates from our models of what we, our cultural models of beauty, that she's still so feminine and so self-confident. All right, so what I really want to be thinking about is how this issue of self-confidence reflects racial discourse and how we can situate it within the kind of the bigger discourses we've been talking about. The self-confidence discourse is really interesting because particularly in kind of the late 2000s and early 2010s, there was a lot of discussion about self-confidence and women, particularly about women's pay. We saw the publication of Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, which is one among many books that encourages women to try to be more self-confident in the workplace. We saw the publication of The Confidence Code by Shipman and Kay, I think. And that was a book that was explicitly written to try to, as a self-help manual, to help women try to get more raises and succeed more in the workplace. And one of the implicit assumptions behind this discourse was that women the pay gap between men and women in this country was lagging in part because women just weren't being confident enough. And we're trying to create a discourse to encourage women to be more self-confident. A number of critics were quick to point out, though, the hypocrisy and the problems of this discourse, which is that it essentially blames women for their own oppression in the culture. It says that if we have a problem with how we pay men and women in this country, the solution is for women to change, for women to seek out self-help books, for women to transform themselves in order to achieve the success that they want. And this is, in fact, a major discourse of contemporary culture associated with the idea of neoliberalism, that in the contemporary neoliberal world, how people achieve success is through constant self-discipline and self-transformation. We've seen the boom in kind of the self-help genre. We've seen TED Talks teaching us how to be more creative and think more creatively, that in a world in which labor markets are constantly shifting and adapting and people are expected to do more contract labor and kind of work off the books, it's everyone's responsibility to transform themselves if they want to be successful, not pay attention to larger structural changes that are impacting joblessness, that impact poverty, but rather to teach people to say, hey, this is your problem and it's your individual choices that can pull you out of that. So this is particularly relevant for understanding Gabourey Sidibe because that's the implicit the implicit argument around this argument of self-confidence, that it's Gabourey Sidibe's self-confidence that allowed her to rise from a kind of lower middle class nobody living in Harlem to a film star, that it's her bubbly self-confidence and assertiveness that got her where she is. And so it creates this really interesting narrative about how we solve the problems of kind of racial inequality in this country, is not to look hard at structural conditions, but to focus on individuals and individual choices. That the solutions there are to look at how people can transform themselves to better adapt to the conditions of the marketplace rather than changing the bigger structural conditions in the world. Yeah. I think her, yeah, So individual solutions. I think her case is really interesting too when we think about the obesity epidemic, because a lot of the discourses around body positivity and around the idea of self-confidence as a kind of an alternative narrative to the obesity epidemic is largely focused on whiteness, about white upper middle class women asserting their own self-confidence and their own ability to transgress kind of the beauty norms of the culture at large. And oftentimes when we see women of color in these discourses, they're often being used by kind of largely white movements to showcase their inclusivity, to say, oh, we're not just talking about whiteness at all. And so there's an interesting way in which Sidibe often gets used in kind of magazines that have larger white readerships, like Good Housekeeping, as a kind of an icon to teach women self-confidence and to show that this is an inclusive vision of self-confidence. Yeah, I don't need to talk too much about that. All right, so I wanted to end then by talking about how this impacts how we see Precious, because there's a really interesting dynamic at play if we look at Precious. How many people have seen Precious? Anybody? Just a few. So it's a really hard movie to watch. It's a movie that takes place in 1980s Harlem. Gabourey Sidibe plays a functionally illiterate young woman who is pregnant with her second child, both of which are the result of being raped by her own father. She lives with her highly abusive mother, both emotionally and physically abusive mother, and it's about her struggles to achieve success and try to kind of break free of those cycles of abuse. And she does that largely by becoming enrolled in a special school that helps her learn to read, helps her understand her place in history, and through the help of her social worker. So the lessons of Precious are really interesting because it's a movie that's very much about community and about social services, that the keys to success to deal with the traumas of poverty for Black communities in Precious are education, having strong education where you have dedicated teachers who help you, having social services that provide you the support, and creating a community of other people that can provide backup for you. And so the movie Precious ends with the sense that Precious is going to go out into the world and try to do something different, or at least to have a little bit more reflexivity about her possibility and her potential. She's also HIV positive. And so it's a hard movie to watch, but it's a really interesting lesson. Now, throughout the movie, though, when Precious is dealing with her abuse, she kind of lapses into these fantasy states where she doesn't have to deal with the realities in front of her. And in those fantasy states, she imagines herself as a movie star, as someone walking the red carpet with the paparazzi snapping pictures, someone wearing fancy dresses. In many ways, she imagines herself as Gabourey Sidibe. Right? Someone who gets to go to the Oscars and gets to wear the fancy dresses of designer, who does have paparazzi taking her picture. So if the lesson of Precious initially is to think about social services, think about education, think about structures of support, the narrative of Gabourey Sidibe's fame says, forget that stuff. The lesson should be self-confidence and fame and celebrity. That what's going to achieve success for you is this vision of being able to wear the fancy dresses, being assertively feminine and smiling and charming, and that's what's going to pull you out of poverty and despair. In the movie, those fantasies, she has to move beyond those fantasies. She has to reject that sense of kind of leaving reality and fantasizing about those visions of fame and focus more on support, focus on the world around her. But the narrative of Gabourey Sidibe says, no, focus on fame, focus on celebrity, focus on self-confidence as a solution to the problems of racial inequality in the world. So, yeah, and I think these lessons kind of carry over into some of her roles, in which most of her major roles that she's taken on since Precious have placed her not as someone who attains a certain amount of success for herself, but as a figure who helps typically middle-aged white women achieve their own sense of self-confidence. Somebody who can teach these white women to accept themselves and embrace a certain set of self-confidence. So she does this in The Big C. I don't know if anybody watched that show. It's a show with Laura Linney about a middle-aged teacher who is diagnosed with cancer, and Gabourey Sidibe plays one of her students who helps her kind of adjust in that time. In American Horror Story Season 3, she very much plays this supporting role where she helps kind of a middle-aged white woman who's a witch, because it's a horror story, achieve a sense of self-actualization. So there's an interesting pattern in which she becomes this figure that suggests self-confidence, and then the industry immediately starts using her for roles that help white women achieve a sense of self-confidence and ignore a lot of the issues raised by Precious as a film. So I think that's probably good for now. I'll see if you have any questions. Happy to chat. Yeah.
So when you looked at all these magazine articles and you probably did statistics of what people said on there,
Yeah.
how did that compare with statistics of Halle Bailey or Barry or whatever?
I don't have any comparative statistics because I didn't do the data on somebody like Halle Berry, but it definitely plays across the other case studies I looked at. Self-confidence becomes a major discourse when talking about Melissa McCarthy, when talking about Peter Dinklage, when talking about Betty White, when talking about Laverne Cox. That when we're dealing with celebrities that deviate from our definitions of beauty, that's kind of the go-to narrative for a lot of entertainment journalism, is to focus on how they achieved that fame. So I don't have the statistics for the other celebrities, but that's certainly something that we don't talk about, for example, with male celebrities, right? We don't talk about how George Clooney got where he is because he's just such a self-confident guy, right? He's powerful and serious and good at what he does. We do see it somewhat with more female celebrities, but oftentimes our discourses around celebrity are around innate talent and the idea that there's something special about them that they don't need to bolster, whereas when it's a celebrity with a body that doesn't fit within our set of cultural norms, there has to be something else that shows why they made it. Yeah? Yeah?
Were these the sorts of descriptions similar for Oprah when she was coming up? She's a large woman, or
Mm-hmm.
was larger than she is now, but still large.
Yeah.
She promotes self-confidence also, and that was her line as well.
Yeah, so there's interesting research on Oprah. It definitely matches up with early Oprah when she starts when she starts becoming more of a kind of a national figure. Oprah's star persona shifts more, less as someone who needs self-confidence to more the kind of the powerful media magnate. But there's actually the most prominent discourse that we actually see with Oprah, like today, it compares her to Jesus, right? That we see her as this like spiritual figure. If you read a lot of the coverage of Oprah, they compare her to that she's a powerful spiritual figure who helps other people achieve their own sense of self-confidence. I think that's the direction we see with Gabourey Sidibe, is that she gets put into these contexts that are supposed to help other people achieve their own sense of self-confidence, because she is this figure that's just kind of bubbly and self-confident all the time. But there are some overlaps there that you see with Oprah as well. Yeah, so, absolutely. Yeah.
Would the reason why people always talk about self-confidence with Oprah and Sidibe, would that be because, but they don't talk about it with like George Clooney, would that be because the social stigmas towards male actors and males in general is that you're expected to be self-confident already, and it's not so much the other way?
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly how we define masculinity and femininity. Although I think we don't talk about self-confidence as much with masculinity because we normalize it so much, right? If you're not self-confident as a man, you're weak, right? You're emasculated in a certain way. So we do expect it to a certain degree, but we don't label it in the same way. It's the labeling that I'm really interested in here, in how we take certain types of behaviors from different people and say, okay, we're going to label this as X and this is Y. So even though Sidibe doesn't necessarily behave differently in interviews as other stars, it gets labeled as self-confident because that's the narrative that gets created by it. So, yeah, but it absolutely has to do with the ways we define masculinity and femininity and how that's intersected by our ideas about race. Yeah.
Have you looked at all in how men with similar body types are perceived in Hollywood? Because you either see them as a funny guy, typically, or even as the bad guy. But I don't really see that outside of that role.
Yeah, and this is one of the kind of the most famous like double standards of Hollywood is that men who are larger, find more roles. There are more places for them. We are happy to imagine them as kind of sitcom, funny dads, married to beautiful women, and that there are many more roles for that. So there's some interesting research on that as well, because we have such a long history of these kinds of larger, working class, lovable loser male figures that in many ways tell us about masculinity. They could get constructed as a way to show that, men, we need to support men in the culture too. That look at how I'm trying to articulate this. That there are men out there who we should also be supporting because they deviate from this. But of course, like there's so many of them. They do get stereotyped into certain types of roles as well. But there are many more of those roles. Typically, around comedy and the idea that they are funny. So you can look at Kevin James today, who has a much more successful career than Gabourey Sidibe, but he has a very specific kind of niche of this kind of lovable loser fellow that we want to root for.
One thing that was coming to mind as you were explaining these scenarios, Simon, do you remember, that fits into this equation, I think. Simon Cowell made the comment, what was the vocalist's name, the woman, Kathy Bowles, I think? She had the operatic voice, but she had an image that wasn't the stereotypical thing. And he made the comment that I couldn't believe that this voice came from this body or something like that. But was she, Sidibe, your initial study, or was there another, where did this light bulb go off for you? What was the role and what was the...
Well, so I think the first case study I did on this was actually looking at Peter Dinklage, the dwarf actor from Game of Thrones, largely because most of my background comes from masculinity studies, and I was thinking about kind of new research and thinking about why we have why we've made room for a dwarf actor like Peter Dinklage, who is also kind of celebrated as this icon of like, oh, look at this progressive change, right? He's somebody who can take on roles that would never go to a dwarf actor in the past. And so I think that got started, but then I started thinking about like, when I started making the lists of other stars who kind of correlate with that, the list kept growing and growing and growing. And so I think I focused on Sidibe because there's too many to choose from today. There's so many different kind of examples. But I was thinking about Melissa McCarthy and thinking about the role of self-confidence in Melissa McCarthy, and think about how that applies when we add kind of the level of kind of racial discourse. The case studies I focus on are all supposed to be focusing on different categories of bodies that are seen as typically out of control or sources of anxiety. So thinking about overweight women's bodies, overweight African American bodies, thinking about immigrant bodies, thinking about disabled bodies, the bodies of the elderly, transgender bodies. So all of the case studies are supposed to be focused around those types of categories. So that's I think why I got started on it. But I think that what you're getting at is that there's this core tension in the culture right now, in that thanks, I think, largely to the obesity epidemic, we still engage in a fair amount of body shaming all the time, and oftentimes that gets justified through ideas of science, and it's okay to tell someone who's obese that they are unhealthy and they need to change themselves. And we have TV shows built around this very premise that we should shame people's bodies. Yet at the same time, we've increasingly kind of adopted feminist principles about media and body image. That we created this discourse about inner beauty. That women should love themselves the way they are. Everyone should find their own sense of inner beauty and self-confidence. And Dove has created a whole ad campaign around this idea. So there's these two contradictions that we have right now, and that's really what I was interested in getting at the core of the idea that we still kind of openly stigmatize bodies like Sidibe's, as you can see in some of the reviewers who made pretty mean-spirited comments about their appearance. Yet at the same time, we're increasingly encouraged to accept those bodies and say inner beauty is beautiful and important. So it's that contradiction that I want to get at there, and that's why I kind of went with Sidibe. But yeah, that instance with Simon Cowell is, I think, central to this as well. Yeah.
Instead of standing back and observing and writing and commenting like you are today about these people, have you ever thought of taking it a bit further and meeting them?
Yeah, so That's certainly something I would like to do with the research. I think it would be a different angle because and see what they do. So one of my advisors that I worked with when I was a graduate student wrote an amazing book about unruly women in culture in the 90s, and one of the big case studies was Roseanne Barr Arnold. And she wrote that book, and then she did a kind of an in-depth interview with Roseanne as well. And it was really interesting to kind of put those pieces together. But there's a distinction that needs to be made, though, because as I said before, ultimately what the star has to say about their role in the culture tells us answers a different question than how they are constructed. There's a lot of stars that fight against the way that media constructs them and the way that media tells their narrative, whereas other stars kind of roll with it a little bit. So it'd be interesting to get their perspective on how they see the discrepancy between themselves as a person and their mediated personas. But for this one, I want to make the claim about how and why media constructs them in a certain way. But yeah, that would be a really interesting counterpoint.
Not just how media constructs them, but how they live their lives daily.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm a social worker, so when you go into that kind of thing, the world opens up to total realism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it would definitely be an interesting kind of counterpoint to this. Yeah.
It seems to me that we make exceptions for stars. So we've sort of opened up the window or the door for a broader acceptance of different body types and different personality types. But by the same token, I think this is what you're getting at too, maybe it's just a different way of saying it, is that we make an exception for the star, but in the broader culture, we're not as accepting of that body type and that personality type. And that we still find it somehow offensive or whatever the right term is. We'll say, okay, it's okay if you're a star, you can do that, you can be obese. But in the broader culture, we're saying, no, it's not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of research, particularly around African American women and obesity and the stigmas that they face, and kind of the not to mention thinking about issues of poverty and race as they intersect in this country. So yeah, and that's in many ways, of course, the history of Stardom. Period is selecting out these key examples of people that say like, oh look, they made it, they're special, they're unique. We can focus on their successes and feel better about our culture, and not look around and see the inequalities around us. When you think about like the power of the Hollywood star system during the Great Depression, and how it created similar narratives about class and about success and meritocracy that allows us to say, okay, we look at the stars and we are able to say, oh, look at these amazing things that are possible in America, that we can include more people, that people can kind of go from rags to riches, and that we can achieve this a better place that didn't match with the realities of inequality around people every day. So that's absolutely one of the things I'm interested in and thinking about, not just how we make exceptions for stars, but how those exceptions have to be framed in a very particular way in order to get us to accept those exceptions, given the dissonance between the realities of oppression on a day-to-day basis and our willingness to kind of celebrate stars who kind of deviate from our social norms. I think you had a question too.
Oh, yeah. Did you run into anything with your research where, like, the confidence isn't portrayed as feminine and then they're seen as maybe, like, glossy or pushy?
Not for these particular stars. This is, of course, what happens with Roseanne Arnold, and that. And I talked about her case in comparison to Melissa McCarthy's in the larger project. But her, she is initially constructed as this kind of, assertive, self-confident woman, but she quickly becomes an object of kind of discord in U.S. culture, that people loved her or hate her, and that she was seen as this kind of bossy, aggressive, particularly in the ways that she was kind of represented working class femininity that we weren't used to seeing in pop culture at the time. And so she definitely kind of pushes over from that. Typically what happens when that, in the cases that happens, that person stops becoming a star, right? They go through a kind of a downward spiral, and you can kind of see that with somebody like Katherine Heigl, who had kind of this brief moment, but then when her star persona shifted to becoming, even though she kind of looks like our expectations for a movie star, when her star persona shifted to becoming more bossy, hard to work with, aggressive, she's kind of fallen off the map a little bit. So I think part of it is the nature of being a celebrity at this particular moment means that you haven't that discourse hasn't quite been applied to you yet, and that might change. And we see this with Melissa McCarthy as well, who is always constructed as imminently lovable in every context. And if that changes, then she becomes an out of control, overweight woman. The interesting thing is with the men that I look at as well, that sense of self-confidence becomes more a sense of kind of coolness. Like when you look at Peter Dinklage, a lot of the discourses around his sense of self-confidence talk about like what kind of him as like this urban hipster who can just kind of walk around and people will be either like harassing him because he's a dwarf or fawning over him because he's a star, but he can just stay cool as a cucumber, and that's part of like how he succeeds in his own self-confidence. So it definitely has a gendered component to it as well.
One last question? If not, I invite you to come back next week for the last colloquium before Thanksgiving break, featuring historian Keith Peterson talking about John Mullen and his road. I invite you to stick around and ask questions individually of our speaker. But let's thank Russ for